it's not going to get brushed up a lot. If the glasses keep hitting it, you're going to get.
Well, I can do that. You need a sound check or just?
I think we're going to
Need a sound check? Need a sound check? Here.
how long you're going to talk.
No, I'm going to talk about this way so I can yell at the people in the back row. This is my normal speaking. Whatever makes you happy. Tickles me plumb to death. Are you through traveling for a while? Where you?
Not now. Not INS meeting and that's it.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to be out. I'm going to be there that week too.
Yes.
We're still trying to find out. We don't have a clue what's happening. I would love to be able to tell you what my vision is, but I don't have a clue. I talked to Scott and Dave. They don't know, what's going to happen. So they can't even tell me whether there is an education component in the combined. They don't know.
Yeah.
And if there is, they don't know what the focus is going to be. So I have told them there will be an institute next year. We're going to do we'll do this as a similar institute next year that we did this year, and then at that point, I can't guarantee anything.
Yes. I mean, I thought Dewey already has a strategy. It looks like they don't.
They don't. No. Why did you take away my presentation? You make me nervous. You always look like you're going to church.
Maybe I am. What am I like?
The only time I put on a coat and tie like that is when I'm going to a wedding or a funeral, which I view pretty much equal. Or if I got to go to court, which again I view as pretty much equal.
There was a movie for weddings and funerals.
So I'm looking to be impressed here.
I hope your expectations are pretty low.
No, they're quite high. Dr. Doster, do any 402 rules on cell phones still apply here?
Yeah, so I'm going to yell at Dr. Murdy if his cell phone goes off during the presentation.
Don't do that.
I'll come and take it away from him, throw it in the trash.
Will you fail him?
Yeah. What are you doing?
I got to do a quick conference call, so I'll be just the first half.
Okay.
I'll get done.
So am I going to have to bring the presentation back up?
No, I got it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the live stream now. So it'll be live stream, and I can edit the first part of it later
Okay.
when we
All
archive
right.
it. So just,
Okay.
you're live
Okay.
starting as soon as I push this button.
Okay.
Okay?
All right.
So it's recording. Go here, here, and you're set to go.
Okay.
All right. So I'll see you down here in a few. I'll watch the first half of it from my computer, so
Okay.
should be good.
All right.
Just, you should be good to go.
Right. Okay. So
See you in a few.
it's a field of view runs from about here to Muhammad. This is the field of view. Okay. All right.
This is your safe space.
Saved by safe space. Okay. All right.
This year we have better attendance than last year.
Yeah.
Last year, at a certain point, it was in back.
Yeah. Crowd.
Yeah, this year is
I don't know whether they're just some of them are in my maybe. Yeah, if you die, that will put a real downer on the presentation. Just die quietly, okay? There you go. There you go.
Good afternoon. Our today seminar speaker, Dr. Michael Doster, he doesn't need special introduction, all of you know him. But I will just distinguished undergraduate professor of nuclear engineering, undergraduate program, And maybe you know me in PhD at NC State, so he's throughout my NC State. And he has over 20 years of experience in developing high fidelity full plant simulation capability for normal, off-normal operational conditions, models for evaluation of advanced control strategies for conventional and next generation light water reactor, including small modular reactors. Dr. recent work focused on novel deployment strategy for small modular reactor and nuclear hybrid energy systems. And the topic of this seminar is on this. So please, let's say a warm welcome to
Thank you. I appreciate all of you coming out, particularly those who aren't being paid to be here. So I'd like to first acknowledge Dr. Connor Frick. Connor got his finished his PhD and graduated this past May. This work is drawn almost entirely from his PhD thesis. So I do want to acknowledge that up front. Connor, I understand, is watching this live streaming, so if I didn't at least mention his name, I'd hear about it. So as was mentioned, I'm going to talk about coupling thermal energy storage systems to small modular reactors. This is an area that's getting increased interest considering the penetration of renewable energy sources that are going on the grid and the impact that that has on electric demand and on the economic, if you consider conventional deployments. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what is a nuclear hybrid energy system. What do we mean by that? I'm going to talk a little bit about particular integral pressurized water reactors. This work is applicable to any kind of small modular reactor. The ones that we have been concentrating on have been integral pressurized water reactors. Those are the ones which are likely, say, within the next 20 years. There are other small modular reactor designs out there, but they're not nearly to the point of commercialization and deployment as integral pressurized water reactors. I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation for thermal energy storage or storage period. Talk about the design of a particular thermal energy storage system, and then look at coupling that to a light water reactor, one of these integral pressurized water reactors, and show you what the implications are in terms of operation, changes in control strategy, change in operational strategy, and then draw some conclusions. I would like this to be more interactive than not, so feel free to stop me, yell, scream, raise your hand if you like. I'd like this to be more of a discussion than just me yelling at you. I apologize for the temperature in the room. It's hot for me. I assume it is for you too. Okay, so hybrid energy systems. There is an increasing concern among some regarding climate change, and this motivated reductions in greenhouse emissions. One of the solutions that has been proposed, and you have probably seen this, is increased penetration of renewable energy sources. This can include wind, it can include solar. There are others out there, but wind and solar tends to be the ones that we have looked at and that you see deployed a lot. You don't have to spend much time driving through eastern North Carolina to see large sections of what used to be cropland now occupied by solar panels. Consequences of that are when they put out electricity, that goes to the grid. That impacts the net electric demand that is seen by the rest of the providers on the grid. So this results in distortions, if you will, of the electric demand that your baseload units have to respond to. There are also other energy needs that we have that are non-energy producing that also have a carbon footprint. For example, pulp and paper, which is a big industry in North Carolina, they need process steam. There are a number of applications into petrochemical fertilizer production, a number of processes that require process steam. So, how do you get that process steam? You can burn coal, you can burn gas, whatever, but there are also non-electric needs for thermal energy. So hybrid energy systems, what we try to do is we now have a more complex energy. It's an energy picture, not an electric picture anymore. So the hybrid energy system idea is that you have an energy demand and an energy supply, and electricity, thermal energy, whatever. And how do you balance all of those needs? So I have pirated a diagram from Idaho National Laboratory this is a sample hybrid energy system. There are other configurations, but this one is at least typical. So what you would see here is you've got nuclear here as one of your suppliers. You can have concentrated solar. Nuclear and concentrated solar tend to provide high temperature, high pressure steam. You also can have then electric producers, wind and solar. Both the concentrated solar, the wind, and the PV solar, those can be intermittent. They depend on the weather patterns, they depend on the location. So your thermal sources go to some junction, and you can either send that off to some power generation scheme, you can divert that thermal energy to a chemical process, say desalination of water, for example, is a chemical process. And I'm of the believer that potable water is going to be increasingly in short supply as we go forward. With salination of some of the aquifers and other things that we're seeing, you don't have to look very far in the Southwest to see demands for potable water increasing. So consider that as one of them. Excess capacity, thermal capacity, can go into a thermal storage system. That's going to be one of the about. Excess electric can go into battery storage or whatever. And so all of that feeds into either electric supply that goes to the grid or some production of some product, fertilizer, water, whatever, pulp and paper, whatever. And so what we're interested in then is balancing all of the thermal, electrical resources to the various demands that we have. That complicates the picture a lot. How do you deploy nuclear power systems in a complicated mix like this, where everything that perturbs one of these feeds back to the reactor? The reactor or the nuclear part, particularly complex, is any perturbation that you have on the production ends up feeding back through the thermohydraulic systems, through your energy conversion systems, to the reactor. So how do you balance all of this while maintaining the reactor is safe and maintaining and minimizing perturbations to the reactor system? So I work with mechanical engineers and electrical engineers and whatever on this, and I try to convince them that even when it's not about the reactor, it's about the reactor. It's always about the reactor. And anything that they do, any connection that you make to that system has implications in terms of the reactor performance, operation of the reactor, and the reactor behavior. Whatever trips your trigger, okay, whatever you want. You can have lithium-ion batteries tend to have higher density, but they don't. But they also tend to blow up. So it could be whatever battery you like. Okay, so it doesn't matter. So our focus has been on the small modular reactors for the nuclear component. These things tend to be, and so SMRs, they are an ideal candidate for this. If you look at the small modular reactor designs that are out there, they tend to be in the hundreds of megawatts thermal range, not the thousands. So you'll see them, they range from in the 100 to 200 megawatt thermal to say 500 megawatt thermal with electric outputs in the order of 40 to 50 megawatts electric to say 100 and 200 megawatts electric. Now you can take these things and you can build a system by adding lots and lots of little ones. You can stack them up if you like. The ones that I'm going to talk about, again, are integral pressurized water designs. I'm going to talk about those, what they look like. And these have more applications than simply base load production like we're used to. There is a move among some of the military bases to be independent of the typical electric grid, to essentially be their own producer and their own consumer. So they have needs for not only electric power, but let's say you want to use steam for residential heating. You can use it for that. They also might include wind and solar as flexibility on the grid. So these things have applications for, say, military bases. Remote industrial installations. Many of the plants, for example, they're called cogeneration plants. If you're looking at pulp and paper, for example, they may burn coal to produce steam, but the steam that they need for their process is low temperature, low pressure steam, so they run it through a turbine first to make some electricity, and then they use the leftover exhaust steam to run through let's say the chemical process. So there are industrial applications where you could replace some fossil burner by a nuclear plant. And then small remote communities. You have some place out in the Yukon or whatever. They have, in addition to electrical, they have thermal needs. So there are different applications for this. You could have some remote military base where they want to pop a reactor down and run it for a while. So and disclaimer, I have no financial interest in mPower, B&W, or any of these others. I have used this as a design, or simply as an example. On the left-hand side is a typical B&W 3,000 megawatt plant, typical loop structure with once-through steam generators. It's, again, about 3,000 megawatts. There's your representative person. All right? This is an integral pressurized water reactor. The integral has all components within the reactor vessel. So, steam generators, pressurizer, everything. It's all one unit. So, I'll talk a little bit more about this. So, this is the core down here. So the size of this thing is about the size of one steam generator in a typical loop type reactor. This thing can be put on a rail car and shipped, the whole thing. Right? Or on the flatbed of a truck, shipped. Makes that convenient. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the components of this thing, but the whole plant, everything that you see here on the left-hand side is now contained in here. And that is convenient. You'll see that there are no pipes sending outside the reactor vessel. You cannot have a large break loca because there's no piping outside the reactor vessel. The only penetrations to the reactor vessel are the steam lines for the feed water and the steam coming out. So that, from a safety point of view, makes them very nice. You eliminate entire classes of accidents that could happen as a consequences of these designs. So it makes them nice. There are a number of reactor designs of this type. mPower is one that was being developed by B&W. Westinghouse has their own version. NuScale has a version. But they all look like this. Okay? They all have this same sort of configuration. So if you look at this one in particular, then you have core down here. Water comes, so the flow loop for the whole primary side. Water goes through the core, up through some structure here, through a riser, into this upper area here. Here are your reactor coolant pumps. They're mounted on top of the vessel. That moves the flow. Because you have this large riser here, there is a very much enhanced component of the flow that is natural circulation. So you don't need these massive thousands of horsepower reactor coolant pumps anymore. These pumps can sit right on top and move the flow. The secondary side, feed water comes in, flows alongside your steam generator. So your steam generator tubes are right here inside the reactor vessel. So the primary side comes in, runs through the tubes, then down your downcomer, up through the core, and that's your complete primary side flow loop. Secondary side comes in, feed comes in, runs along the outside of the tubes typically, and then the steam comes out. So the only penetrations to the reactor vessel again are the steam lines, feed line and steam line coming in. There will normally be two of these things, so you're not two feed lines and steam lines coming out, so and you have some symmetry on both sides of the core. So that's what one of these things look like. The pressurizer is mounted on top of the vessel. So any insurge and outsurge goes into here and out. So the typical pressurizer behavior, but it's just mounted on the vessel. There's no surge line, separate line that you have there. So pressurizer, heaters, and sprays, and all are contained in here. So it's a cute little system. All right. Now, the difference between, say, this system and NuScale's natural circulation system is you take the reactor coolant pumps off, and then you have a natural circulation reactor. You still have the riser, and you typically have to operate at somewhat smaller power levels if you go to pure natural circulation. But again, the design is essentially the same. There are some small differences, but the design is effectively the same. So it doesn't matter. Scale natural circulation, mPower, forced convection, Westinghouse's version, it doesn't matter. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about here is as you increase the penetration of these intermittent variable electric sources, then what that does is the electric demand seen by the reactor side changes. So it alters the load profile. It means that the load profile can be intermittent. It can be variable from day to day. You don't know what it is when you're planning, and as you add more and more of this stuff, you add that intermittency to the mix. So what we want to do is deploy reactors into this environment, and this intermittency that you see, even if you're not talking about remote locations or what, even if you're just talking about deploying in a standard grid, the addition of these intermittent energy sources is having a dramatic impact on the electric have been load plants. The electric demand, you can, since these are generally required to take whatever's produced by wind and solar, it goes directly to the grid. That means that the other energy sources have to be powered down in particular. There are cases in California and some other locations where there is oversupply of electricity. Production exceeds demand, and the pricing goes negative. Utilities have to pay people to take the electricity they produce. That's not a good business model. There have been instances, even in North Carolina, I have heard that the production by electricity was sufficiently large that they had to down power one of their nuclear plants. There was so much excess capacity on the grid just from intermittence. And again, that's not a good business model. So how do you do that then? How do you accommodate this? So, well, a couple of things you can do is you can operate your reactor with what is called load. So you let the power of the reactor follow whatever the load demand is. This results in this has several negative consequences. One is you have lost energy potential. It's not operating your system at full capacity. The other is if you operate under load follow mode, then you're causing additional thermal and mechanical stresses on all your components. You're causing pressures to go up and down, temperatures to go up and down, power to shift around in the core. You're operating valves and motors and pumps and stuff in a way that you just don't normally do. Normally you bring the reactor up, it goes full power, and it stays that way for 18 months, and then you bring it down. When you're operating a reactor in this mode, it adds a lot of additional thermal and mechanical stresses. So that's not, while it is an operating strategy, it's one that is not terribly attractive. Another is I operate the reactor at 100% power, but during those times of excess capacity, I take the excess steam that I produce and simply bypass it directly to the condenser. So I produce whatever electricity is required, and then the extra steam that I produce running the reactor at full power, I simply bypass to the condenser. Now that mitigates some of the thermal cycling and so on, but it's also not a good financial model because, again, that's lost energy potential. You're just simply producing steam and then dumping it. A third option, and the one that we have been looking at, is that you operate the reactor at steady state, and steady state here is, in quotes, no reactor ever operates pure steady state. There's always some little fluctuation. But you operate the reactor at nearly steady state, and then you bypass the excess steam to some thermal energy storage system that you can then recoup later. So you then use that steam that you have stored, you store that energy. You can then either recoup it later by producing steam and reintroducing it into the power conversion cycle, or you can take that steam and use it in some chemical process, or you can use it for desalinating water, whatever. But you take that, take the excess energy when you've got it, store it, and then you retrieve it later for some purpose. And the economics dictate what the purpose is. So there's no one unique design. You tell me what the purpose is, and you design the system and optimize the system for it. So all of these loads involve additional thermal and mechanical stresses to the reactor and or systems, because if you're bypassing steam, that means valves are opening and closing. But what you're hoping to do is move those stressors that may have existed on the primary side or on the steam generator, and you move it to some other auxiliary system that might be easier to maintain, easier to replace the components. You move those stressors to some other place in the system and get them away from the reactor. So our role in this is we have been developing the simulation models necessary to describe systems like this. Everything from the reactor all the way to the condenser, the balance of plant in between, the thermal energy storage system. So none of the models that I'm going to talk about can you buy off the shelf. They're all generated by me, Dr. Frick, or some of the other students that have worked with us. So none of the models you see, one, you can't buy them because no one's ever built one. All of the models that you see have been, again, developed in-house. They've all been sized. All of the designs have been developed in-house. All of the components have been sized. All of the control strategies have been formulated by myself and the students.
But you may be willing to sell.
At my age, I don't care. Okay. So let me first talk about the systems model. So the driver of this is the reactor system, is the integral pressurized water reactor. So we have a model of an integral pressurized water reactor. it can handle systems that have both force and circulation. If you just simply take the reactor coolant pumps off, then you have a natural circulation reactor. You have to optimize it differently, but the configuration is the same. The models are all time dependent. You have to be able to accommodate time varying loads. You have to be able to accommodate time varying powers. So everything is dynamic. The whole system is dynamic. Nothing essentially works at steady state in this. So as a consequence of that, you have to have kinetics models to generate what the reactor power is. You have to have control rod banks. So the model includes overlapping control rod banks that move in and out in order to maintain the power at some programmed level. It has xenon. Because the power level can fluctuate, xenon production, decay, and the xenon feedback has to be accounted for. Xenon has the nasty habit of having a time constant that's about on the same time frame as the operating history or operating period, and you can drive your system unstable if you're not careful. We have moderator temperature, fuel temperature feedbacks, decay heat, all of those time varying parameters that you don't worry about normally, you have to take models. Because you might be running these things into transients that you're not used to dealing with. We also model hot channels with critical heat flux. Thermal margins are, and whether or not the deployment strategy threatens any of your safety margins. We can do that. So it has the full pressurizer heaters and sprays. We can handle conventional once-through steam generators, helical coil once-through steam generators. Some of these designs have helical coils in them. The balance of plant, turbines, feed, condensers, all of the associated control functions that go into handling this. All of that's included in here. And we've developed models, as I said, for an mPower sized system. It's not mPower because they won't give me their dimensions. So the system is of the class of an mPower sized system, about 500 megawatts thermal. We can also do NuScale, and we've got a NuScale model that's about finished. And that's about thermal. All right, in that range. Then we have made modifications to allow coupling of this thing to a thermal energy system. So that's what we've been doing. All right, so if you're going to bypass steam, you have a number of options. And this is what makes this stuff different than doing paper reactors or toy reactors. If you're going to be doing this and doing this seriously, you have to take into account all the valves, all the motors, everything that's going to be in line if you're really going to figure out how to do this right. It's not enough to just say, well, I'm assuming the reactor will just operate at steady state. There's a lot that is required to make that statement true. And that's where the devil's in the details. So if you're going to bypass steam, a conventional steam line has the generators to some pressure equalization header. This is conventional. You then take steam lines off, typically there's about 4 of them, through some turbine control valve into the high pressure stage or the impulse stage of the high pressure turbine. That's conventional. Steam expands, you have some exhaust here that goes through moisture separator reheaters into the low pressure turbine and then out to the condenser. So that's conventional. If you're going to be bypassing steam, then you have a number of connection points you can choose depending on the application to where am I going to take the steam from. One choice is to take the steam off the pressure equalization header prior to upstream of the turbine control valves. Now the turbine control valves modulate based on what the demand is. The demand is about full power. Turbine control valves are full open. And all of the steam is going down the lines to the turbines. Under periods of low electric output to be low, those valves modulate closed. So depending on what the electric demand is and what you're trying to do on your turbine side, those turbine control valves move up and down. So if you do your connection point up here, upstream of the turbine valves, then you're fairly insensitive to what happens downstream of the turbine control valves. So if you want constant pressure, constant steam conditions, you want to connect up here. There are downsizes to that, and I'll mention what that is later. You can go downstream of the turbine control valves, and you can bypass steam here. There's some disadvantages of that too. One is you can essentially take all of the steam you want from there, but as the load changes, as these turbine control valves modulate up and down, the steam conditions that you get here change. So you don't get constant pressure conditions. Maybe you care, maybe you don't, but that's a disadvantage. And so any connection point downstream of the turbine control valve, you have the potential for significantly time varying conditions of the steam that's being bypassed to your storage system. So that's the downside. You can even, if you want low pressure, low temperature steam applications, you can either take a tap off the low pressure turbine and send that off. Now again, the conditions coming out of there are a function of whatever's happening on these turbine control valves. So if you remember your standard thermo, if you've looked at a Rankine cycle, you take turbine taps off to here. The conditions that you have here are dependent on what the impulse pressure is. As you change that pressure, all of the tap pressures downstream of there at every turbine location change. So if you lower the impulse pressure to the turbine, every tap pressure downstream changes. Your feed temperature changes. Everything that is a function of those tap pressures changes. So that's another complication you have to be concerned with. Again, that's what makes real systems different than paper reactors. You have to take this into account. All right, so here's our thermal energy storage system. Again, this one is one that we have proposed, and this is the way it works. And what I have shown you is a system that has been used in some thermal energy applications, and it's a sensible heat system, which is called a two-tank system. You've got a hot tank and a cold tank. During times of excess capacity, and I've shown a connection point here at the pressure equalization header, you take bypass steam, you send it through an intermediate heat exchanger, you pump fluid from the cold tank through the intermediate heat exchanger and store it in the hot tank. And you pump it at a rate such that the exit temperature at the end of that thing is constant. So when you have a lot of excess capacity, you pump the fluid at a high rate. When you have low excess capacity, you pump the fluid at a slow rate. And so the controller, based on how much you put through there, is based on making sure that the fluid going to the hot tank is constant temperature. So what I have shown you is a configuration in the charging mode. So you pump through here, and then whatever is condensed here would go to the condenser or downstream or some other location. Then if you want to recoup that, then you take that constant temperature hot fluid, you drop it through a steam generator, producing steam, which I put here into a steam dome, and then that goes out to some downstream location, and you can use it you can either put it back into your energy conversion cycle, make electricity with it, you can send it off to some ancillary activity, process steam, desalination, whatever you want. So you can then produce steam during the discharge mode through this system and then dump it, okay? So I have shown you, there are two modes of operation. Again, this is configured in the charging mode. Again, the steam conditions you have going to this thing depend on where you connect the bypass valves to the steam line. I have chosen to do the main pressure equalization header. And Thermonol 66, again, I don't have financial interest in it. It is a conventional energy storage fluid. It's an oil. It has very nice conditions over wide temperature ranges. So people say, why don't you use molten salts? They'll freeze. I don't want my fluid freezing at any point. Okay. All right, so don't worry about all these equations. Here's the connection point and the control strategy. Again, these control strategies had to be developed because they don't exist. So we're assuming that you have once-through steam generators as part of the integral pressurized water reactor. That's typical. With once-through steam generators, the turbine control valves act as pressure control valves. So they modulate to keep the steam pressure in the steam generators constant. That's their control strategy. So I connect to the pressure equalization header, and the turbine control valves are keeping the pressure there constant. So that gives me constant steam conditions going downstream. So again, that's what this auxiliary bypass valves that you see here are located upstream to provide constant pressure steam conditions. One of the nice things about this configuration also is I can bank those turbine bypass valves and cause them to open in stages. I can open them all at once. I can make them open in stages. I can overlap them, whatever is most optimal. And we've looked at all of those. So the bypass valve, the controller to run these things is based on the difference between the measured flow and some demand signal. And the demand signal is what is required such that I meet the nominal turbine output, and also I keep the reactor power constant. So that's the demand signal. I produce a demand signal for bypass that keeps the reactor running at constant power. So the reactor doesn't know where the steam is going. All the reactor sees is, I need this amount of steam produced. You do with it whatever you want. Send it through a turbine, send it anywhere you want to. So the bypass valve, bypass controller, is run to ensure that regardless of what the demand is, the reactor stays at constant power. And it modulates these valves in order to do that by creating a steam load or steam demand on the system. Okay. So there are additional controllers for the thermal energy storage system, and again, you don't have to worry about it. The auxiliary control valve in the intermediate heat exchanger works to keep the level at some programmed value. That's all you need to know about that. The flow control valve, that's the valve that moves the fluid from the cold tank to the hot tank, and it modulates to keep the exit temperature of that fluid constant. So again, depending on how much bypass steam you have, it will open or close. All right. There's a pressure relief valve in there in case you pressurize the thing. Okay. So there are some considerations here, and I'll just run through these before I start showing you some simulations. The hot tank temperature is based on whatever the saturation temperature is of the steam source. So typically we're running at about a 500 degree temperature. About is what whatever you want, but it's limited to whatever your steam source is. If you're bypassing flow to this consideration, prior to the turbine control valves, you're limited to 45% to 50% nominal steam flow, because if you bypass more steam around the turbine control valve and you send through it, you lose your ability to control pressure. The turbine control valves are your pressure control. If you're not putting any steam through them, you can't control the pressure. So the limit is about 45%. Now, because of efficiency changes and so on, it ends up that you're shedding about 60% of the turbine load. But that doesn't end up, in a practical sense, being very important. One of the things that I have shown you, that condensate from the intermediate heat exchanger, you can drain it to the condenser, but as I'll show you later, that is a source of waste heat that can be used for additional applications. So there's other things you can do with that. So let me show you some simulations here. So let's couple all this stuff together, throw it out there, and let's see what happens. So again, I'm going to show you, first of all, if you operate the reactor in this normal load follow mode. Let's say you just want to operate as a load follower. What does it do? So the turbine control valves operate to maintain the steam generator pressure is essentially constant. Control rods move to maintain some programmed average temperature on the primary side. Feed flow modulates to try to keep to meet the reactor demand, or reactor power, or the turbine demand. There's no direct control of steam generator level. It floats in a once through. And then as a consequence of the level floating as a function of power, the exit steam temperature changes. All of these things are changing as a function of the load profile. And so here's some simulations. The first one is, this is the electric demand, and that's the turbine output. You only see one graph. That's because the turbine output is to within the resolution of the graph. The turbine output is matching the load essentially exactly. Okay. Now, as a consequence, and this is a typical summer day. So 0 is midnight. So the lowest electric demand is around 2 or 3 in the morning. Electric demand peaks at about 3 in the afternoon when everybody's air conditioners are humping. Okay. And then it falls off again as you go into the evening. The reactor power follows the load, hence load follow. Modulate to do that. Your primary coolant temperatures change as a function of the reactor power. Your control rod, this shows the banks, A, bank, B, there's 4 banks, A, B, C, and D. A, B, and C last, D is the first one back in. So in this simulation, A, B, and C are in their full out position, but bank D is moving in and or in and out based on what the demand is. Now, as this control, with this moving in and out, the load, the power profile in the reactor is changing as a consequence of that. And so you're changing the power distribution in the reactor axially. This has implications in terms of stresses on the system, all sorts of stuff. Okay, that's why people don't like to do it. All right. A couple of other things. Primary pressure, that's dull. The steam generator exit temperature is varying as at the highest power, the level in the steam generator is the highest, and so the temperature leaving is the lowest. Lowest power, the level in the steam generator is the lowest. The exit temperature is the highest. So you've got 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit of steam temperature variation in your steam generator tubes. Steam pressure, the steam pressure that the steam generator sees is constant. This is the pressure at the turbine impulse. So that's the pressure of the steam going into the high pressure turbine. That is what is going to be propagated downstream at every pressure tap all the way to the turbine exhaust. So that's significant. And then your feed temperature, and just because we're nuclear engineers and we like to mix up units, these temperatures are in Fahrenheit and these are in Celsius. So you're talking about a 50-degree change here in terms of Fahrenheit in terms of the feed temperature. That is the temperature entering the steam generators. So you're cycling the inlet temperature to the steam generator significantly. That increases thermal stresses. You would like to avoid that. So what happens if you couple it to our thermal energy storage system? So we have the exact same load profile. Turbine output still exactly matches the electric demand. The reactor power is effectively constant. You say, no, it's not. Look at all those bumps and wiggles. Look at the scale. 530 is nominal. So the peak is 531 and 530, or 529 and a half. So out of 500 megawatts, you're varying a megawatt. And these are hours, so that's not a spike. You're changing a megawatt over, that's steady, that's pretty constant. All right, that's pretty flat. And primary temperatures are flat since the power's changed. Since the primary temperatures are not going up and down, you don't have any insurge and outsurge of the pressurizer. You're not cycling pressurizer heaters and sprays. You removed all of those stressors. So you've gotten rid of a lot of those things just in this. So this is running it in a charging mode. So this proved it would work. Okay, this proved it would work. Now, there are a couple of other things here. This is on the thermal energy storage side. So again, if you look at the turbine impulse pressure, it hasn't changed. That's still seen by the turbine control valves still operating to meet the electric demand. So, but this is your bypass flow. In the bypass flow, when you have low electric demand, a lot of bypass flow. When you have high electric demand, low bypass flow. So it sort of is, as Connor would say, it's an x-axis reflection of what the load demand looks like. Okay. The thermal energy storage, here's their flow through from the hot tank to the cold tank, and it essentially follows the bypass flow. So during periods of high bypass flow, you put a lot of fluid through there. During periods of low bypass, you put a little bit of fluid through the heat exchanger, and the consequence is the controller is set to maintain the outlet temperature constant. That's pretty constant. Okay, so the controllers worked. That worked. Okay, so let me show you the discharge mode. So in the discharge mode, you take the fluid that you have stored in the hot tank, you send it through the steam generator, making steam, and then what I have shown is configuring this thing as a peaking unit. The potential exists that if I store enough steam, then I can, during times of increased demand, I can produce sufficient steam to actually run the turbine output at higher than the nominal rated value of the reactor. You can run it as a peaking unit. All right, so you store excess capacity in times of low demand, and then you recoup it later, generate steam, reinsert it into the energy conversion cycle, and produce more electricity. And so you can run it as a peaking unit. So that's the way this thing has been configured. You have to choose a reintroduction point. I chose to put the steam back in at the high pressure turbine exhaust upstream of the moisture separators reheaters. I let the moisture separator reheaters equalize both streams because the exhaust from the high pressure turbine may not have the same conditions as the steam coming from the steam dome. I put everything in, let it mix up, put it in the moisture separator reheaters, so what goes in the low pressure turbine looks all the same. And then you can choose whatever peaking capacity you want. All that does is impact the size of the heat exchanger that you have. You have to design the heat exchanger, design the size of the tanks in order to do this. So what does this work? Well, if it didn't, I wouldn't be doing it. We'll skip this. I'm running out of time. Let me show you the results. All right. So this system has nominal conditions where the the conventional system was 180 megawatts electric. So the system was nominal capacity would run at 500 megawatts thermal reactor. 180 megawatts electric is nominal. So what we said is we're going to design the peaking unit side. We're going to design the thermal energy storage, the intermediate heat, all of this stuff to provide 35 extra megawatt capacity electric. And we size the system accordingly. So here's the electric demand. And so what we've done is simply scale that typical summer day where before it would peak out at 180. Now we have it peak out at 225 or 215, 35 extra. So we're going to try to recover, take that steam that we stored and use that to produce an additional 35 megawatts electric above the nameplate. Now in order to do this, you'd have to size your turbines and everything downstream to be able to accommodate the additional capacity, but that's fine. Oversize the low pressure turbine, you oversize the generator to be able to accommodate the extra load. So that's easy. So the reactor, so during this period, I am bypassing steam and charging up the high temperature tank. During this period, I am discharging the high temperature tank through the steam generator, producing steam and refilling the cold. The switch occurs automatically between charging and discharge modes. The reactor power here, that's when you're charging. When you're discharging, at that point you've effectively decoupled everything from the reactor, so the reactor just sits there and runs at 100% power. It's nice and happy. So this is discharge, the reactor's running, and then here you're charging again once you fall back here. Primary temperatures are constant. Look at the steam generator dry out location. The steam generator has only minor fluctuations in the level. So we've taken some of those stressors off of the steam generator. If you look at the bypass flows, this is the charging. So you're sending bypass steam. You're not charging at all here, so there's no bypass flow. And then you're charging again down here. Here's the flow from the cold tank to the hot tank, and during this discharge time, you're not sending any of it. And here are the tank levels. So during the charging period, the hot tank is going up, the cold tank's going down. During the discharge, hot tank's going down, cold tank's going up. Okay? So it worked like it was supposed to. Now, what about if you put in solar? The peak solar output tends to occur during that time of the day. All right, during the middle of the day, in the afternoon. It's when your peak solar tends to occur. So what that does is this is that typical summer day profile taking off solar generation of about 15%. And it alters the load profile. So you take that same system and you run it with this load profile. So during this entire time you're charging. You discharge as a peaking unit. When the solar fails, you have additional demand, and then you're charging here. Again, the reactor power is effectively constant. Here, what you see is that you're having much larger charging cycles, so the hot fluid tank level goes up further, and again, the fluid temperatures in the tank are constant. Let me move on. I'm running out of time. What?
Can come part of the solar power, in electric, goes directly to the storage, the energy storage?
You could send it to an electric storage.
Yes.
Okay. You could or what you could do is you could run it through electric heaters, and then if you wanted to, the combinations there are lots of them. Okay. So this is 3 days. And again, so if you're going to, the problem with it, if you're going to size one of these things, you have to take into account that this thing's going to be cycling over a number of days. The solar profile and the load profile does not have to be the same on every day. So you have to, and while we have not optimized the system for all possible considerations, we did look at running it for 3 days, where the first 2 days are the regular sunny summer day with solar, and then the third day is cloudy. So you get 10% of the solar, you don't get all of the solar. And you can run any scenario you want, and all that does is you pick a scenario and a time frame, and then you have to design and optimize your system to accommodate that. We didn't try to do that. That's a whole infinite number of PhD theses, all right, in doing that. So for the first two, you see the level in the hot tank cycling, and the second day, you're not producing near as much solar, so you get a lot more discharge from your thermal energy storage system. You still match the load, electric demand. You're able to handle the peaks without any issues. Reactor power stays effectively constant, so this is a 72-hour run, and then the rest of this is, again, fairly dull. Okay. How about a winter day? In winter, your loads are peak in the morning when people are getting up, and they peak in the evening when you get home. Now, this does not have solar involved. You can throw solar in it too. But this one, you take the same system and you run it for a winter day. Again, the reactor doesn't care, and your tank levels fluctuate in order to handle it. So again, the point here is you're going to design a system that's going to have to accommodate load profiles, which can vary from the typical summer day to the typical winter day and everything in between. And you have to how do you optimize the system? That's a big design problem. And we didn't try to address that. We just said, can we make it work at all? If it doesn't work, then you can't optimize anything. Okay. So suppose you wanted to, instead of making electricity, you wanted water. Suppose. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my reactor and I'm going to make water. And I'm going to do this by running a multi-stage flash desalination plant. They require constant steam. They don't want time-varying steam. They want constant steam supply. Well, what I have to do now is I'm going to meet my electric demand. I've got some electric demand I want to meet. Plus, I'm going to provide steam at a constant rate to some chemical process. So I've got two things going on at the same time. I'm running my plant, and I don't have any peaking unit here. It tops out at 180. I run my plant to make electricity and meet the electric demand. And during periods of excess capacity, I store steam in my thermal energy storage system, and then I don't store steam in terms of when I don't have excess capacity. But I am running the discharge and the charge continuously. The discharge is always running because I've got to be making steam all the time. And so I use the thermal energy storage system as a buffer. During times of excess capacity, I charge up or try to charge up the hot tank. But I'm always discharging it, always discharging it. So the hot tank is running, I'm charging all the time and I'm discharging all the time, constantly, all right, running it in a complete loop. So I use it as a buffer. So the electric load is met. Steam demand is, I'm meeting the steam demand, it's constant. Reactor power is constant. And here what I have shown you is over the 24-hour cycle, during the charging period, I'm essentially constant. During the discharge, I'm discharging more than I'm charging. So this system would not do multiple cycles. But again, what we were doing here is, could we make it work? So I would have to resize the system to be able to put additional capacity in there to be able to make up for have additional storage capacity. But at least it works. You're able to run the system as continuous charging and discharging, running both at the same time, providing constant steam conditions to some ancillary application downstream. So that we were able to show that we could do that too. Okay. Now, we have collaborated with some of our colleagues over mechanical engineering, and one of the applications that they have is producing chilled water facilities. And what you typically do is you run steam through some absorption chillers. You store chilled water in a stratified storage tank. So you charge that up with cold water during periods of excess capacity, and then you send cold water to meet your cooling facility load. Now, the original idea we had was to connect this to the low-pressure turbine tap because that's low-pressure steam. The problem was, As you cycle the load, the conditions going in here were varying all over the place, and it just didn't work. So we said, okay, that's not a good idea. Are we doomed? Well, no. During, I think it was Connor's preliminary exam, I said, we've got all of this water sitting in the hot well, intermediate heat exchanger, that we have been sending just straight to the condenser. That stuff's at 700 psi. It's saturated liquid at 700 psi. I make a lot of it during periods of excess capacity. I don't make a lot of it during periods of high demand. That's perfect. That's exactly what you want to do. So you drop the water across some low let-down orifice to a flash vessel. You take the steam, and Connor came up with this configuration. You take the steam, you run it through some valves. You take what you need to run to the chillers. You provide essentially constant steam to the chillers. You bypass the extra steam to the condenser. You take the liquid and run it to the condenser. The mass flow going in here, again, is you have a lot of mass flow available during periods of low demand. You don't have much during high demand. It's exactly what you would like. Now, does this work? Okay. So this one's busy, but it's fun. So here's what we've got going on. During periods of low electric demand, I'm charging the hot side of the thermal energy storage system. Okay? So I'm charging up the hot tank during a period of low electric demand, charging up the hot tank in the thermal energy storage system. I'm taking the condensate from the intermediate heat exchanger and charging up the cold tank for the chiller. All right, that stratified storage tank. So that's occurring. So during this period, I'm charging the hot tank for the thermal energy storage system, and I am charging up the cold stratified, I'm running my absorption chillers at full capacity and charging up the storage tank. During this period, I'm running my peaking unit, so I discharge the thermal energy storage system to produce excess additional electricity. I also discharge the cold stratified storage tank to meet my additional cooling demands, which are going to be during the hottest part of the day. So all of those things are occurring at the same time. Closing, you're slinging water and steam everywhere, all at the same time. Does it work? If it didn't, I wouldn't be here. So the reactor doesn't care. Okay? The reactor operates at essentially constant power. I've already shown you that the peaking unit part works, so we're able to meet our electric demand. This shows you the bypass flow going into the intermediate heat exchanger. So part of that steam goes to running the absorption chillers. That's the steam I need going to the absorption chillers. The excess capacity I send out through the bypass lines. So the chillers run at 100% capacity while the tank, cold water tank fills up. It gets to full capacity about here. The chillers cut off. Then this is my facility cooling demand. During the hottest part of the day is when the highest cooling capacity is needed. So the chilled water tank is discharging as I meet my cooling water loads. I'm running my peaking unit during this period. And then once I get on the downside of my demand curve, I go and start charging the cold water storage tank back up. I'm starting to charge back up my thermal energy storage system. So all of this is going on at the same time. So I would submit to you this is not a steady state system. All right, so we've got so you can couple this thing and couple all of these different processes at the same time. So and your deployment strategy is completely different. Obviously, the optimization strategy depends on what your application is. And there's no one size fits all. So, conclusions. I am going to finish on time. Okay. So, what we've done is I hope I've demonstrated that with the feasibility of these systems. You can couple small modular reactors to thermal energy storage systems, and as a consequence of that, you can minimize power swings. You can minimize thermal and mechanical stresses on the reactor side by buffering all of those perturbations that you see from getting to the reactor side. So you minimize thermal stresses, mechanical stresses, and that doesn't mean you get rid of them. Valves open, you've moved them to another less vulnerable part of the system, say, what you've done. And something that might be easier to get at. You could take it out of service. The plant's still running, right? You could get at it. You could have parallel trains, take them out of service or whatever you need to do. So you move those to the less vulnerable part of the system. You can accommodate and minimize the effects of various levels of renewables because the system can be sized to accommodate any potential load profile you want. In fact, the load profile can be chosen not to meet the electric demand, but to meet some price structure. So for example, if you have the situation where electricity has time varying rates, then what you do is you store energy during periods of low demand and then generate electricity out the yin-yang during periods of high prices. And so your demand profile can be set by price, not by what the electric demand is. And you can let some other resource meet the electric demand during periods of low. Natural gas, for example, is cheap. All right? And then run your more expensive generators, store the energy, and then recoup that later. So that's purely financial. That's not energy conservation. That's money conservation at that point. But you can do it. It's up to you. What's your... Okay? The systems like this allow for combined reactor and thermal energy storage systems where the net output, the loads exceed the nominal reactor system as a peaking unit. That may be valuable. Okay? You can optimize it for any electric load profile. I would say you can optimize it for any energy demand profile and energy demand mix. Okay, but it's going to be different depending on what your demand mix, production, it's going to be, so the optimization is going to be different. So again, you could connect it, any ancillary applications, desalination, whatever you want. Right? Hydrogen, petrochemical industry, pulp and paper. Again, the optimum size and configuration depend on on your location, what intermittent resources do you have, what ancillary applications do you have. So the optimum strategy will depend on what your generator mix and your demand mix looks like. And there is no one size fits all. One of the things that is of interest, it turns out, is conventional power plants are now interested in this. I demonstrated this for small modular reactors. There's no reason in the world you couldn't design a system like this and connect it to Sharon Harris. Okay? So if Sharon Harris found itself in a situation where, because of renewables on the grid, they might have to consider load follow, this might be an option. They could add a system like this to keep the reactor running and then recoup that energy later. So you could, while again, I showed this for small modular reactors, once you get past the steam production side, everything downstream is just how much capacity do you need? So with that, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues over mechanical. Corey Meisenheimer, now Dr. Corey Meisenheimer, is the one who developed the absorption chiller models and the stratified storage tank models, working with Dr. Steve Terry over mechanical engineering. Corey and Connor worked together to come up with the configuration for the flash vessel so Connor could provide the control strategies needed for the steam to go to the absorption chillers. And then Corey used our models to do his optimization work. So I do want to acknowledge their contributions to this. And with that, I'll answer any questions that you have. So it's just water, right? How hard can it be? Yeah.
So going back to the original schematic where you had the reactor hooked up to the chemical plant and the solar and wind generating sites. What's this?
Yeah, it's one. Yeah, okay. Yep.
So since all of this affects the reactor, which part of this would be under the jurisdiction of the NRC for regulation?
Anything that connects, I would say anything that connects to the balance of plant. Okay. So in fact, what I did not show is one of the things Connor did was, because you have connected this to the balance of plant, then perturbations in the thermal energy, failures in the thermal energy storage system feed back through the balance of plant to the reactor. So he did a limited accident analysis to show if you failed one of the feed valves, if one of the bypass valves failed open, if all of them failed open, then what happens? And the answer is they don't provide sufficient, you're able to accommodate them within your current reactor safety system. They don't, because opening up the turbine bypass valves for this system doesn't look that much different than the normal turbine bypass valves opening that you already have on the system anyway. So it may be a different magnitude, you're able to accommodate it. So we've done limited, but you'd have to incorporate that in your failure modes and show that this doesn't add anything additional. Okay.
You don't need any extra hardware?
You don't need any, you need all of the additional extra hardware for the thermal energy storage system, all of that. You would need to tap, and it's easy to do when you're designing a system, it's harder to retrofit. But you would need to connect to the pressure equalization header. That's relatively easy to do, particularly if you design the system from the beginning. Balance of plant is essentially unaffected. The controllers, you just modify the controllers, but the same valves and everything else on the rest of the balance of plant are different. They're not changed. So the only additional hardware that you need is the piping to connect the thermal energy storage system to draw steam from the steam lines, and then if you're going to re-inject it, to re-inject the steam back into the steam lines. That's all, and then whatever's in between those 2 points.
So it can be done.
You can retrofit it, yes. You can, yes. In fact, I gave this talk at MIT, and there were people there from the utilities who are interested in this as a retrofit option to current generation. Okay, now it's harder to do, and the other thing is most of the low pressure turbine condensers, generators are not oversized to be able to handle peaking unit capacity. They may have a little bit of excess capacity, but so you're looking at, if you want to run it as a peaking unit, you'd have to replace the low pressure turbine with a higher capacity low pressure turbine. Is it worth it? Maybe. If you're starting with a new plant, it's easy to do this up front. Okay? And so that's what, when we're looking at this, is if you're designing a new plant up front, then this is something that's relatively easy to build in. It's a little bit harder to retrofit. But you could certainly do it if you're thinking about a new build or a new install. Yes, ma'am.
What's the typical efficiency of the TES system?
Not run a bunch of efficiency numbers because it depends. There's a lot of things. The efficiency changes as you utilize more of the bypass steam. So if you're recouping all of the energy, you don't lose much. Okay, but then a lot of it becomes more economics and it becomes more thermal efficiencies. So we haven't run. Again, it depends on the configuration and what you're trying to do, how many things you try to connect up, how much of the bypass steam energy you try to recoup. So it becomes more of an economic game, and you can afford to lose some if as a peaking unit. So you can pay for the by electricity, excess electricity when to come into it.
You said you could keep the bypass at different locations and the steam line. So
Well, you could, yes, you can configure it at different locations.
which, according to you, would be more efficient in respect to the mechanical stresses on the reactor?
They all have similar. You can mitigate, I think you can mitigate the stresses on the reactor by the configuration that I've shown. One of the things I did not show was because the impulse pressure of the turbine is varying regardless of all of this, feed temperature is still changing. Well, one of the things you can do with that hot well liquid that's sitting in there is you can add an additional feed water heater upstream of your normal feed train, And so when the turbine control valves are closing and you're sending in cold water that would normally be going through the steam to the steam generator, you run it through an extra feed heater, bump the temperature back up. So at the topical meeting, Controls Topical, Connor's already got that one working, and showed that you add another feed heater in there. When do you need the most steam to heat it up? During times of excess capacity, and you've got it. So you can essentially level out the feed temperature going back. So there are things you can do to mitigate all of these thermal stresses. You can't get rid of them all. Okay, and there are certain things like the turbine control valve going up and down, those there's nothing you can do with. As long as you've got a time varying electric load that you're trying to match, those turbine control valves are going to be moving up and down. So those are going to be variable. But you can mitigate a lot of the other stuff. Did I see another question? Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. With that, if you're interested in fun, so just drop by the office, okay, and we'll chat.
I was raising up my hand, but
Oh, I'm sorry.
it's fine. It's like I'm just thinking if the starting point of this research is basically just the project which we did. We had the nodal points, like 1D nodal points in the core and the steam generator, and then we have the velocity and the temperature coupled solver, and then we just add the electricity models, load models, and all the additional models needed for the